Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's hybrid meeting and presentation with the Los Alamos Mountaineers. Before we get started, I wanted to make everyone aware that this presentation is being recorded. I am Ashley Lusher, Program Coordinator at the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I will be the moderator for tonight's talk. I want to acknowledge our wonderful members and donors for their generous support. For details about other PEEC programs, please visit peaknature.org. Just a few logistics before this presentation gets started. Our presenter will be taking questions via Zoom chat and from our in-person audience. For those of you watching from home, find the chat feature in the Zoom app menu bar. Type your question to the PEEC moderator, Ashley, in the chat window at any time during the talk, and I'll read them during the Q&A at the end. Please remember that not everyone in the room here with us has a microphone, so there may be a delay when we're listening to a question from a live audience member. Don't worry, we'll be back in a second to repeat the question for everyone to hear. Lastly, after this talk, you will receive a short evaluation. Please take a moment to fill that out. Your input helps us improve future programs. I will now pass it over to Tony and Jeff to start the Mountaineers meeting.
Okay, everyone, welcome to tonight's Los Alamos Mountaineers program. I think we have a really great program. So just a few things before we start. First of all, I just want to remind people that our potpourri is December 13th at Fuller Lodge, and you'll be getting some information on that soon, shortly. Then I'm going to talk about our proposed Los Alamos Mountaineers elected officers and board members. So this month we talk about who we're proposing. Next month we vote on the folks. Jeff Click will then give a trip report, the trip reports and upcoming trips, and then I will introduce Colin Hemez, who is I spelled his name wrong, who will talk about Rail Diaries Snowdonia. Okay, sorry, Colin. So just, we did change the bylaws. So we used to have, I think, 4 elected members of the board. Now we have 8. And so they're up there. This is actually from the current bylaws. Then we have up to 3 more additional voting members that the board needs to elect. And so I'm going to talk about who our nominating committee is suggesting. Just the reason I'm showing this is because every time I put 8 members up, everybody says, oh, but we only elect 4. And that's not true anymore. All right, so this is our proposed Los Alamos Mountaineers slate. So President Sylvie Adam, Vice President Evan Rose, Treasurer Cecile Hemez, Secretary Ellen Mills, Trip Coordinator Jean Duert, Program Chair Juliana Fessenden, Equipment Manager Jeff Click, and Membership Chair Clarissa Jablinski. Sorry. And then there are 3 additional board positions: webmaster, Zach Baker's been doing this forever; publicity coordinator, a great job too; Bill Podorski; and program co-chair Ann Sentagi. And then the past president actually is myself, and that's really not elected. When you elect a president, that person automatically becomes past president. So you're electing someone for 2 years and you're stuck with me for another year. I want to thank the nominating committee, which was chaired by Juliana Fessenden, Patty Walls, Michael Altair, and Clarissa Jablinski are also members of the committee, and they did a great job this year because we usually have a hard time finding members that are willing to do this, but I think it is really rewarding. Okay, and with that, yes, any questions?
I recall that there could be nominations from the floor.
Right, and
is that next month?
Well, that's next month. Yeah, so I should say we actually did canvass a lot. The nominating committee canvassed a lot, and we think we have all the people that really wanted to be part of the board. But if there are other folks that you think should be part of the board, or if you want to self-nominate, let someone on the current board know. Let myself, Bill Podorski, or Juliana Fessenden. Those would be the best people, I think, to contact. or anyone on the board if you'd like, or members of the nominating committee as well. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Click, who's going to talk about the trip reports.
Okay, we had a number of club trips, and we had a lot of individual trips that folks sent me great pictures on that I thought I would present on. So the Moon Over Hoodoos trip leaders were Michael Altair and Olivia Lee, and they had 18 participants. They had to break into 2 groups in order to meet the wilderness rules, and that was a great trip. Here is the one of the most of the group, I think, and then here's the group that went out of the south trailhead, and then here's what it looks like out there. Just really wonderful country if you haven't been before. And here is what it looks like out there at night with a full moon. Isn't that awesome? And here's what it looks like at sunrise. Look at those happy campers. Then we had end of the season Monday night hike on a Tuesday night, led by Ellen Mills and Pat Walls. And we had numerous participants and had a wonderful potluck dinner at Pat's home after. That was a nice outing. And then we had the joint peak lamb hike, the fall day hike in the Nambe Badlands, led by Clarissa Yablinsky, and she had 20 participants. Look at that group. Isn't that amazing? And she's holding a little soft llama, is what I heard. So every trip's a llama trip. And here's what that country looks like. Had some kids on that outing. It was a nice family outing. And then Bill Produnsky led a llama adventure to Harris Wash in the Grand Staircase Escalante. And they had 8 participants on that. And now there is a fine specimen of a llama if I've ever seen one. And he looks like he knows it. They had a lot of animal tracks right near their camp, bears and mountain lions, very fresh, and foxes and all kinds of wildlife there, right? So I'm sorry, I may be blocking you guys' view here. And there's Alan showing the appropriate way to view a solar eclipse, which occurred while they were out there. This gives you a sense of kind of some of the grandeur of that country. This is in the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And then we had a number of adventurous trips by Lamb Club members. Martin Staley, who I inadvertently left him off last month, did the Tour de Mont Blanc. That's 103 miles around Mont Blanc. This is on my bucket list to do, and it's just gorgeous. Look at that scenery. And he was hiking about 10 miles every day with lots of elevation. So that was quite the circuit. And I think some of our past members, Jason Halliday and Bill Geist, did this there's a competitive run that goes in one direction that's done every year. I think they presented on that in one of our programs a couple of years back, and Martin may do a presentation on that again. That was a guided trip. And then we had the annual Zion National Park canyoneering trip with Evan Rose and Roy and Laura Bond and John Davey and Steve Renault. And they did Birch Hollow, Pine Creek, Mystery, and Diana's Throne in Zion. And at Capitol Reef, they did Arch Nemesis, Cassidy Arch, North Wash Canyon, and Hogwarts. And here's Evan on a rappel and Cassidy Arch. And just a safety share on this trip, we had a number of injuries, and they were not typically on rope. We had a couple folks, one person that had an injury on the approach to one of the rappels, and another person in the canyon after the rappel. So walking can be more dangerous than rappelling if you're not careful. So it's easy just to not think about that. So then we had a backpack trip to the Middle Fork of the Gila River. Gwendolyn Gallagher, Don Creer, Dennis Brandt, and myself. If you haven't been in this part of the country, and we've got another trip coming up to here that we'll talk about in future trips. It was my first time in the Gila Wilderness, and it is just lush in there, just beautiful. This trail had about 20 to 30 creek crossings and lots of beaver activity. We probably saw 30 beaver dams, I would say, on this trip. Just remarkable. And there's some more pictures, and the canyon geology is just very cool with lots of great formations. And then Michael Walker summited Brighthorn and Como Pedroso, which is the highest peak in Andorra. Brighthorn is in between Italy and Switzerland in that kind of that boundary area. Yes. And so here's some nice pictures. This is Brighthorn, I believe, right? And then this is on the approach to Andorra. Is this? So, and then Sylvie Adam, Jean Dewart, and Robbie Mulford, and about 17 others did a self-guided raft boat trip on the Desolation Gray on the Green River. This is also on my bucket list. Have not done this one yet. And it looks like they had a great trip with lots of kids, and it looks like they had a great group there. And then Franz Cordova, Elizabeth Kelly, Cindy Fuqua, Tash Ostrander, and Chris Foster had various October trips. Here they are at Aspen Vista. And then here they are at the Saddle before you drop down into Lake Catherine, the Saddle with Santa Fe Baldy. And here they are at Lake Catherine, and they were celebrating Elizabeth Kelly's 80th birthday. Is she looking awesome for 80? It's just really looking great, huh? And they did that as a day hike. And then Carrie Schmeck did a Nambe Lake day hike. And again, lots of great fall colors on these trips. And then we had Brett Kettering and Jay Smart and Michael Liggett did a couple of different backpacking trips. The Great Allegheny Passage, 150 miles, in the Chesapeake and Ohio Towpath, 200 miles. And so here's some pics of them. And here's some of the fall scenery and river that on one section of that. And then for future Los Alamos Mountaineers Club trips, we have Chupadera Mountain coming up this coming weekend. Sylvie Adam is leading that trip. That's down in the Socorro area, and the what's the next to the Bosque. Bosque del Pachi, thank you. And then the fall color bike ride to the Gilman Tunnels that Ross Lemons is leading on Sunday. And then Bill's leading his annual Moab Bike Hike Explore in the first week of November. And then we have Carrie leading a Gila cliff dwelling that's right in the same area that we were backpacking, that we showed some pics from, with backpacking in hot springs. And we actually went into, if it's probably the same springs we went into, just beautiful country in there. I really highly recommend that. Bluff hiking weekend, late November, early December, led by Bill. And then Michael Altair is graciously leading the 2023 Avalanche Refresher course. There'll be a Wednesday course on the 6th here at Peak, I believe. Is that for the classroom session? And then that following weekend on a Saturday, they'll be doing an outdoor session. And just an invitation to future trip leaders. I encourage you to consider leading one trip this year. Simple day trips are an easy way to start. No trip is too small. Contact me for trip ideas or help with any of the logistics on that, and for trip planning and preparation. And here we are at our main attraction, why you're all here.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is actually in Boston right now. This is a virtual talk. So our speaker is Colin Hemez. He was born in France, but grew up in Los Alamos, where he ran, skied, and climbed. He spent many summers with the Youth Conservation Corps, actually building and improving trails around Los Alamos. He then was an undergraduate student at Yale University, where he studied biomedical engineering and art history. And in his studies of art history, he studied the history of photography of nuclear weapons tests. So that's interesting. Currently, he's in the Boston area, as I said. He's pursuing his PhD in biophysics, where he's developing gene editing technologies to treat genetic diseases. So with that, we'll go to Colin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Can everyone hear me okay and see the screen that I'm sharing? It should be a black screen with some text. Can I just get some confirmation that that's okay?
Colin, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a really special opportunity to have the chance to tell a story to all of you. I feel a little nervous. It's funny. As I'm part of a teaching staff for a class at Harvard this fall, and I had to give a 2-hour lecture on gene editing technologies last Friday, which I was like kind of whatever about. But this feels a little bit different, in part because you're all a very special audience to me, and in part because I feel deeply invested in what I'm about to tell you today. So I'll do my best to tell you a good story. You might be asking why am I here? And there's only ever one kind of true answer to that question. I'm here because of my mother. Many, if not all of you know Cecile, and I'm thankful to her for making me, and also for the other members of the LAM board for giving me the chance to talk today. I'm also here because I grew up in Los Alamos, because I learned to ski at Pajarito, because I learned to run in high school alongside the Hipwoods and Blake Wood and the Feltons and my many awesome cross-country teammates, because I spent a few summers with Craig Martin and Sylvan Argo and the Youth Conservation Corps building trails around town, and because all of that had a profound effect on the way I think about and move through the world. I went to college in New Haven, Connecticut, and kept running freelance throughout my undergrad years and beyond. New Haven is not a place that's known for its natural beauty, but it actually has really good access to green spaces for a city of its size. And I began to explore the city and its surroundings on my runs, and to map my surroundings and to gain an affinity for certain routes, certain places, sometimes in a way that seemed quite arbitrary to me. I recently drew a map of New Haven as I understand it through running, and realized that I was drawing the paths roughly in the order in which I discovered them, as if I were trying to relive that process of the discovery of a place. I was also struck by how the act of drawing different routes put me on particular trains of thought, how some streets made me recall the solutions to one or another engineering problem set, how some gardens made me remember falling in and out of love. I was struck by my affinity for certain routes, the way certain places and certain thoughts were intimately linked, for the ways in which I had trodden over this landscape, both with my feet and with my mind. And this made me think, as I was studying art history at Yale, of a photograph by the British land artist Richard Long, which I think so beautifully illustrates the way I feel about the time I spent in New Haven. On a warm day in June of 1967, Long took a train heading southeast from London's Waterloo station and disembarked after about 20 miles onto an unremarkable field of grass. He began walking back and forth in a straight line until his footsteps left a discernible spoor in the field, and the sun was sufficiently low in the late afternoon sky to capture the improvised trail in a photograph. A line made by walking, as Long called this work, was the first and the most tender of Long's artworks created by walking through landscapes. I see in Long's photograph an affectionate encounter between a person and a place, a record of an interaction that is short-lived in the physical world, but that leaves a lasting impression in the mind. Many of the routes I ran in New Haven consisted of concrete sidewalks or stony trails, and thus they gave me no chance of leaving a mark through my footsteps alone. But what matters here is not the mark that one leaves on the world. What matters is the mark that the world leaves on one's mind, the mental record of the affinity between land and thought. And I'm smitten with this idea that our mental maps of a place are replete with these traces. manifestations of the eros between bodies and places, vestiges of the longing to be in the world as well as to know the world. All of this is sort of a long-winded way of saying that I have something of a fascination with the phenomenon by which place influences thought. And it is with this awareness in mind that I undertook a hiking trip through the mountains of North Wales. The thoughts I'll share with you today also stem from a somewhat loose tradition that has emerged over the years among close friends to write reports of memorable train journeys. Many friends, a few of whom are on this call, have shared these delightful stories of journeys through the American West, through Caledonia, through northern India. Adventures by rail can be quite a lot of fun, and I've always found that sitting on a train gives me a lot of time and space to think. I left for Snowdonia in August of 2022, trading the soporific heat of the Massachusetts summer for the sterile and equally sedative atmosphere of an airplane cabin. Hop skippity over the Atlantic, a quick stop in Dublin to have a chat with an immigration officer, and through the international arrivals gate of Heathrow, where Thomas, my friend and hiking partner, was waiting for me. Bright-eyed, boot-shod, and rucksack-backed, Thomas held 2 rail tickets to Wales in his hand. The tickets struck me immediately. They noted that they are, quote, valid via any permitted route, unquote, a feature unique to the British rail system made possible by the network's extensive interconnectedness. As long as the path taking is not ludicrously meandering, we were allowed to follow any itinerary of our choosing to get to our destination. Thus began a game of optimization, estimating train delays, calculating the number of seconds needed to run from one platform to another within a connecting station to find the quickest possible route to the land of song. This game kept us occupied for most of the day. We took a train into central London, then another heading north out of the city. Soon we reached England's agricultural core. Charming oaks interrupted hedgerows that delineated fields of wheat and corn. Between sips of coffee, I closed my eyes and pictured an organic network of British rail lines overlaid against this agrarian grid. The image brought to mind what art historian Svetlana Alpers calls the mapping impulse, the need to reconcile the objective traits of a landscape, often recorded in maps, with the subjective experience of the same, often recorded in painting. With few notable exceptions, quote, we can always tell maps and landscapes apart by their look, unquote, writes Alpers in The Art of Describing, her influential study of 17th century Dutch painting. Quote, maps give us the measure of a place and the relationship between places, quantifiable data, while landscape pictures are evocative and aim rather to give us some quality of a place or of the viewer's sense of it, end quote. To map a landscape is to understand a world, but to paint a landscape is to make the world anew. The canvases of Johannes Vermeer and Jacob van Ruysdael are remarkable, Alpers argues, in their ability to unify the seemingly incongruous objectives of landscape mapping and landscape painting within a single visual field. Moving through the British landscape by train, simultaneously optimizing rail routes while savoring the views of crows gleaning wheat from the recently harvested fields, struck me as significant for a similar reason. I felt myself mapping the landscape through experience. As we moved north and west away from London, I thought especially of a series of paintings that Jacob van Ruysdael created in the second half of his career, which spanned across the so-called Dutch Golden Age from about 1640 to his death in 1682. The paintings are called his Haarlem pictures because they invariably depict the Dutch town of Haarlem and its surroundings. Van Ruysdael built a reputation for himself early in his career as a painter whose natural environments displayed a peerless attention to detail. Peter Ashton, a tree expert at Harvard, contends that Van Ruysdael was the first European artist to paint trees and plants with such fastidiousness that their species can be readily identified. The water in his painting of a windmill at Wijk Duurstede features interfering wave patterns that suggest two wave fronts intersecting at an angle with one another. Such patterns are exceedingly short-lived and are difficult to observe from life. To the camera shutter eyes of the 21st century, many of Van Huysdale's natural scenes seem prosaic, pedestrian, and his popularity over the centuries has waned in the aureate light of other 17th century Dutch painters whose acumen for timeless narrative, for mystery and drama became a trademark. Rembrandt and his Night Watch, Vermeer and his Girl with a Pearl Earring. Rembrandt's genius is to leave so much of the world off of his canvases. Van Huysdale's genius is to let so much of the world into them. At the time that they were painted, Van Huysdale's pictures were utterly extraordinary. They still are. Jacob van Huysdale was born into a family of landscapists. Both his father and his father's brother were painters active in the first half of the 17th century. And he was, in all likelihood, well acquainted with the theories on art and art making of his time. I recalled, as our train took us somewhere north of Birmingham, the writings of the Dutch poet and art theorist Carl van Mander, who published a comprehensive survey of the art of the Northern Renaissance in 1604. Van Mander encouraged artists to build relationships with the landscapes they painted through experience, imploring them, for example, to wake early on the summer solstice to watch the sunrise. He conceived of living landscapes as ecologies full of interactions between the animate and the inanimate, replete with traces of what was and what will be. And he challenged painters to search for these traces as they composed their paintings. Van Mander writes of painting a canvas as if building a world. Quote, "Cultivate your foreground," he says, "though not too copiously, by growing there a few fine plants," end quote. As we approach the green hills of the Welsh lowlands, I thought of a passage from Van Mander's treatise on landscape painting that describes the tracks left in the grass by a party of hunters, a passage with a strange and comforting resonance to the line that Richard Long left in the grass some 3 centuries after Van Mander's death. As the Dutch poet writes, quote, "See over there the hunters and hunting dogs, passing through the green dewy fields. See what the trodden dew tells us, giving away with the greener green whither they've gone by the spoor of their footsteps," end quote. Perhaps because of his preoccupation with detail and precision, with world building, with the space between things, Van Mander was also fond of maps. He published biographies of Northern European map makers alongside biographies of painters, and in so doing may have helped to instigate an interest among Dutch Golden Age artists for creating pictures that can function both as paintings and as maps of the landscape, that which Svetlana Alpers would later call the Dutch mapping impulse. Jacob van Huysdale was one of these artists smitten with the mapping impulse, and his view of Haarlem with bleaching grounds, painted sometime in the 1670s, was one of those paintings that flashed in my mind as Thomas and I made our way to Wales. In Van Huysdale's time, linen cloth production was an important industry for the city of Haarlem, second only to beer making, fun fact, and for the towns surrounding it. And the artist chose to depict textile workers laying out freshly woven cloth on a field to be bleached by sunlight. The bleaching field itself, illuminated in sunlight, lies adjacent to a tract of swampy halfland, evocative of low-lying ground that has been reclaimed from the North Sea through the construction of dikes and the action of windmills and the protection of carefully planted hedgerows. Another flavor of world building, perhaps, that has remained so central to Dutch identity, Dutch visual culture, and to the Dutch economy over many centuries. Van Huysdale pushes the city of Haarlem far into the distance, its towers and church spires kissing the horizon. Quote, "Set no buildings in the foreground," end quote, was another of Van Mander's rules for landscape painters. But the buildings play a crucial role in lending the painting its cartographic character. Holland is famously flat, and the only landmarks that jut up from the horizon are man-made structures, churches, windmills, spires, lighthouses. And it is possible to triangulate the precise location from which Van Huysdale painted bleaching grounds based on the relative positions of the church spires. The picture's subtly curved horizon line evokes the curvature of the earth. The curve embeds the scene depicted in bleaching grounds within the space of a larger world, much as lines of latitude and longitude, lines of curvature draped across the surface of the earth by the human mind, function to situate that which is represented on a map within that which is out there in the world. The painting is a map then, though not one made from the vantage of a bird looking directly down upon the earth. It is a map made from the vantage of an earthbound observer, a viewpoint that Van Ruysdael raises above the earth just enough to make all relevant landmarks visible along the horizon. Bleaching Grounds is a picture of a landscape mapped through experience, through vision and movement, through the sensation of wind running through hair and of mud creeping into leather boots. View of Haarlem with Bleaching Grounds confuses the boundary between landscape mapping and landscape painting. As if to confirm that this is his deliberate intent, Van Ruysdael includes the figure of a draughtsman, presumably himself, in the right foreground of the painting, mapping the view before him. By depicting himself as cartographer, Van Ruysdael underscores the cerebral, synthetic, imaginative nature of mapping the world. And yet placing himself within the world of the painting also reinforces the sensuous, intuitive, experiential registers that also contribute to an understanding of place. The Haarlem pictures are hybrid cartographic landscapes intended to simultaneously convey the Dutch landscape as a place that can be walked through with the body and experienced with the mind. My thoughts of maps and paintings and crows and the places they inhabit, already slowed by jet lag and the hypnotic views of the hills undulating outside our train window, became considerably more convoluted when Thomas unfolded a map of North Wales on the table between us. We began planning our route through Snowdonia. We drafted a course beginning with the summit of Snowdon, proceeding south in a counterclockwise arc through the valley of Nant-Gwynant, and ending with a septentrional push into the coastal village of Genvervechen. Our discussions piqued the interest of a gruff-looking man sitting beside Thomas, whose eyes began following Thomas's fingers as they danced across the laminated surface of the map. "Where are you going?" he eventually asked. "Snowdon, Ogwen Valley," we replied. He gave a knowing smile. "Have a good walk." We discovered that he participated in mountain rescue operations in the Lake District. Some logical gymnastics ensued when Thomas began pondering the contingencies for our own journey. He said things to the effect of, "Oh, and if we get in over our head, mountain rescue in Wales is pretty good. I mean, I've heard it's good. I've never needed it. My friends needed it just once." As a result of our route optimizations and train station sprints, we alighted at the northern Welsh town of Bangor 4 hours ahead of schedule. We stopped for lunch, stocked up on provisions for the hike, and boarded a bus headed for the Snowdon Peak trailhead. I watched gulls soaring stiff-winged towards the Isle of Anglesey. Delicate maidenhair ferns writhed delightfully like tentacles from fissures in the stone walls that line the highway into the mountains. We stopped just short of the trailhead to spend the night in a climbers club cottage and began our walk the following morning. To experience Snowdonia is to experience a soundscape as much as a landscape. The mists caress the fells like cold lovers, and there is at times very little to be seen and much to be heard. RAF fighter pilots enjoy using the mountain range as a training ground, thundering low through Ogwen Valley with as much relish as the ravens who inhabit it. Children detest ascending Snowdon in heavy rain, and their cries of anguish ring through the clouds as their parents half drag them up the trail to take in the misty non-views at the summit. And everywhere there are sheep. Their bleats echo across the fells on windless evenings, lonely narrators to dramas unfolding in the fog. They roam the hills in the summer months, grazing on wildflowers and intrepid seedlings. Traces of their presence, tufts of wool snagged on sharp stones, droppings in the grassy fields, carcasses of errant individuals killed the previous winter are always in sight. The sheep are reminders that this is a working landscape, trodden and toiled over for millennia. Over 5 days, Thomas and I strode atop the summits of Snowdon, Triffin, Garnitluelen, and Folgrach. We walked across dry stone walls shrouded in cloaks of moss that have weaved themselves for centuries undisturbed in the shade of the few remaining lowland groves. We tiptoed across flat grasslands so laden with moisture that the ground shook like water mattresses underfoot. We ambled through foothills mottled with dense thickets of thigh-high bracken fern. I understood in this landscape the need for the Welsh word rhedinog, a place that is abounding with ferns. It's a fabulous word, almost whimsical in its precision, but it also serves a utilitarian purpose, describing as it does a salient feature of the region that affects how sheep and people orient themselves to the land. We also took advantage of Great Britain's venerable right to roam policies, navigating freely through private farmlands and exploring misty gullies as quiet as catacombs. As someone raised on a stay in your lane Western American trail ethic, quote, "All you do in the States is follow blazes," muttered Thomas, a UK native at one point in our journey. This more improvised approach to walking made me uneasy at first. But the right to roam in the British Isles is as fundamental to the experience of the British landscape as Smokey the Bear is to the experience of the American landscape. Why the British cherish the right to roam, whereas the Americans, with their extensive tracts of wild and successional landscapes that seem so well suited for roaming, do not, is a fascinating question. Much of the answer, to be sure, is to be found in the deeply intertwined histories of land use and ownership, population expansion and colonization, governance, and national security. But my mental picture of Britain's rail network inscribed within a grid of a landscape mapped both on paper and on the very earth that defines it made me wonder if the right to roam also has roots in the experience, both physical and conceptual, of a place. The yearning to roam freely in the British landscape is an old one. Picture Elizabeth Bennet in the opening scene of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, walking and muddy and briefly liberated. Or J.M.W. Turner traveling through Cornwall on foot in 1811, filling 6 sketchbooks with views of the southern coast over the course of several weeks. But legal protections for roaming are strikingly young, and the right to roam laws extant today are intimately related to the practice and politics of mapping. The modern campaign for the right to roam in Britain began in April 1932, when hundreds of factory workers from Manchester and Sheffield walked in a quote-unquote mass trespass atop Kinderscout, a privately owned grassy plateau in the Peak District. Skirmishes with private gamekeepers ensued. A half-dozen walkers were arrested for their transgression, and the storied British Ramblers Association was formed with the mission of securing public rights of way in the British Isles. Largely thanks to persistent advocacy by the Ramblers over the better part of a century, the right to roam was finally codified in 2000 through the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, cheekily given the acronym CROW. According to the law, members of the public have a right to walk unrestricted within areas of England and Wales that are designated as open access land. CROW came into effect in stages over 5 years following its passage in Parliament, becoming law for different regions of the British countryside at different times. This was primarily because the law included a provision requiring the production of high-quality, definitive maps that depict the boundaries of open access land. Under CROW, footpaths and bridleways not recorded on any such maps by 2026 will cease to be publicly accessible. Like souls departing bodies, the law calls this process extinguishment. The ultimatum has prompted enduring advocacy by the Ramblers Association to identify and record these lost paths that have not yet been recorded on any definitive maps. The organization estimates that some 49,000 miles of footpaths in England and Wales are under threat of extinction if not properly documented. Extinguishment places the burden of proof for a trail's existence on measurement and quantification, on mapping, instead of on walking and experience. The right to roam, that peripatetic genius locus of England and Wales, lives not within the landscapes itself, but within the folds of a map. A right to roam seems to make the most sense only in certain ecological contexts. It does not strike me as a coincidence that the two places I have explored with deeply cherished right to roam policies, Norway and Great Britain, are to a large extent devoid of trees. The very low tree line of the Norwegian Arctic and subarctic ecosystems lead to vast plateaus populated by grass and stone. Likewise, the omnipresent sheep of the Welsh mountains, fond of young foliage and allowed to wander semi-wild in the summer, keep the region in a state of near perfect deforestation. Forests nurse dense undergrowth that makes a landscape less inviting to wanderers, and trees obstruct views. A deforested landscape is therefore more visible, more navigable, and more easily roamed. The second to last day of our hike in Snowdonia began clear and sunny, but turned cool and misty by mid-afternoon. We stopped for lunch at the end of a steep spine running east from the summit of Carnet Llewellyn, watching the fog build in the mountains above. Thomas, familiar with this region of Snowdonia and eager to reach our camping spot for the night, started along the spine before I had finished my sandwiches. He quickly slipped out of view. I watched the mist tease Llewellyn and its neighbors for 20 more minutes before heading up towards the peak in the direction that Thomas had gone, and I entered the fog before I could catch sight of him. I soon lost the trail, a loose line of matted grass between rocky outcroppings, a line like Long's made not by the many footsteps of a single person, but by the single footsteps of many people, and tacked my way up the summit by following the gradient of steepest ascent. I recalled Van Mander again. Quote, "Give thought to the density of the blue-bodied air," he wrote, in a particularly memorable passage of his Dutch treatise on landscape painting. This statement, to give thought to the air, quite pragmatically calls on landscape painters to pay close attention to the sky and to its interactions with the world at large. But taken in the context of Van Mander's conception of landscape as ecology, the passage also hints at the air as a locus of understanding. The modern English and also Dutch root word for things pertaining to the mind, psyche, derives from a word used by the ancient Greeks to mean a thought and also a breath and also a ghost. The Proto-Indo-European root from which we derive the word atmosphere stems from a word that means to blow, to sing, to spiritually arouse. This ancient root word also inspired the name of the blind god Odin, whose two ravens, called Thought and Memory, fly across the earth every morning to survey its goings-on. Air as the free-spirited essence of mind, air as the medium that carries the machinations of mind, thought, and memory, flung far from their source to map the landscape and its happenings below. On ascending mountains, Rebecca Solnit writes that, quote, "As you get higher, the world gets bigger, and you feel smaller in proportion to it, overwhelmed and liberated by how much space is around you, how much room to wander, how much unknown," end quote. But as I trundled up Carnet Llewellyn in the thickening fog, I marveled at how small the earth was becoming, how much space I commanded within my own visual field, which at times did not extend more than 40 feet in any direction around me. To map a world is to know it, to see it. The crisp horizon lines in Van Huystel's Haarlem pictures, the clarity of the space between things, are essential for lending the canvases their map-like qualities. Losing the horizon in this mist, losing the boundary between the ground and the air, between experience and thought, losing the line that demarcates the place in the world at which what you see of it ends and what you know of it begins. Losing this line of reference, I felt the landscape transmute from a physical presentation into a mental representation of itself and back again. My reverie ended when I saw a black sheep and her lamb, stark against the patinated silvers of the fells, watching me in silence as I passed them. I eventually found Thomas at the summit, his blue jacket a beacon against the grays of stone and sky, hunched inside of a windbreak assembled from melon-sized rocks. He was holding his laminated map of Snowdonia in his hand, studying it. He looked up at me, smiling, when I entered the stone circle. I thought I had remembered there being a windbreak here, he told me. Plus, if you look carefully, you can see it on the map. If there ever existed a place that is its own map, that place would be Great Britain. Many, if not most, of the lost paths that are the subjects of the Ramblers' ongoing campaign are not at risk of vanishing from the earth into which they are inscribed. They are at risk of vanishing from the maps that represent them. To make a useful map, one must have full and coherent knowledge of a region. The detailed, beautiful, and readily obtainable maps of the British landscape are a testament to this, as is the totality of the extent to which the landscape itself has been gridded by wheat fields, networked by trains, and trodden by sheep. Britain is a landscape as certain in the mind as it is underfoot. And in the mind's eye, a fully elucidated landscape looks very different to one that retains some of its mystery. I think here of the somewhat unique and deeply symbolic role that wild places play in the American imagination. The untamed landscape is a place of promise, of opportunity, and of discovery, a symbolism exemplified among many other American paintings by Albert Bierstadt's monumental 19th century canvas of Yosemite Valley. Bierstadt shows the sun framed by the valley's imposing cliffs, illuminating the feral forest below. There is a very intentional visual irony embedded within this painting. The sun's golden light is so intense that it obfuscates the view of the valley. This is in striking contrast to the mapped landscape typified in Van Huystel's paintings, crystal clear in every detail, whose lucidity imparts the cartographic character that Alpers observes in her studies. To roam unfettered is to walk a promise fulfilled, and the potential of the American landscape can only be kept alive if some portion of the land itself remains out of reach. We reached the summit of Tryfan in the early evening of a day as bright as polished silver. Owing to its unique craggy geology, Tryfan is said to be the only mountain in Britain that does not have an established footpath leading to its summit. At least with regard to the way it is experienced by hikers, Tryfan is, in some sense, unmappable. Thomas, a seasoned climber, scrambled light-footed to the top, pulling with delight on short pinches of rhyolite. I lumbered behind him, seeking a gentler route of ascent. At the summit, we found the sun settling lazily towards the Ogwen Valley's western aperture, an old world analog to Bierstadt's painting. We saw the Isle of Anglesey in the distance and the valley stretching in gentle curves beneath us. A raven circumambulated the peak, rising on thermals flung from Tryfan's western face and falling again, with airborne somersaults as it rounded the mountain's enshadowed eastern flank. And that's kind of the image I want to leave with you today. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. I'm happy to hear your thoughts, take your questions, have an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. I'm not sure you can hear the round of applause in the room right now, but everyone deeply enjoyed your talk. I'm not seeing any questions on Zoom currently, but do we have any questions here in the room? You can just raise your hand. I think Tony can even bring a microphone to you.
Questions from folks?
And if anyone wants to speak directly to Colin, there's the option of going up to the microphone as well.
Okay.
I know one of my questions watching is, what's your next trip going to be?
I don't have one in mind just yet. Tom and I did a trip, a similar sort of structured trip into the Hebrides this summer. So the islands sort of west of Scotland, and I'm drinking scotch that I brought back from that trip. And I'm not sure. I'm very interested in going up to Baffin Island in Canada, and that might be my next project, but we'll see.
So I actually have a question. What you were backpacking, right? What kind of gear did you take?
Yeah, we had a 2-person tent, sleeping bags, and a small camp stove. You can bring a camp stove, a propane camp stove, into Snowdon and its environs. And we had sort of at any given point, maybe 2 days worth of food with us, but we kind of restocked along the way because the network of valleys within North Wales is kind of nicely interspersed with roads and small towns and places to kind of restock. We hardly carried any water because there's no shortage of water in North Wales, so we just had a water filter that we were able to use for all of our drinking needs.
We have a question from Zoom. What kind of camera did you use to take these amazing photos?
Oh, thanks. That was I took that with my Fuji X100S. It's a micro four thirds camera with I think an APS-C sized sensor. It's a really nice little camera. It's a fixed focal length. I think it's like 35 millimeter full frame equivalent. And it doesn't have tons and tons of kind of bells and whistles to it, but the sensor is really, really good. The color fidelity is tremendously nice, as most Fuji sensors are. And it's just the camera that I take with me on any trip because it's very small, easy to put into a pocket, and generally takes really good photos. And also the fact that it's not like too complex to operate means that you spend less time thinking about your camera and maybe a little bit more time thinking about the landscape, which is also a nice bonus.
Colin, are you following the progress of the mapping of those trails before 2026?
Yeah, I the last I checked was maybe about a year ago when I sort of did some deeper research into this to try to understand what was going on. I don't know the state of it, and I don't know if there's you can, if you Google like British Ramblers Lost Paths, you can get to the website of their campaign where they kind of lay out their mission for this, and they might have a kind of ticker of how many miles of trail they've recovered so far. The criteria for kind of de-extinguishing a trail from the list is really, really interesting. You basically just have to prove that the trail is either in sort of common use and or that it has some sort of profound historical or cultural significance. So what people might call desire lines, the trails that are not actually established, but that are just kind of there by people walking from place to place, that can make it onto the list. There are people researching like the writings of Virginia Woolf to understand like where she walked on her daily walks. try to kind of preserve those paths as being, culturally significant trails that deserve, perpetual public access. It's a very interesting kind of process that is involved in kind of preserving these trails for the future.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions? Anybody in the room or over Zoom? I think we have one here.
Hey, Colin. It's Mike from high school.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Colin. How you doing?
Good.
That's good. I was actually really interested in what you said early on about how you would associate certain paths in the landscape with certain trains of thought. Do you ever set out on new paths with the intent of establishing new trains of thought, or does it always do you just always sort of let it happen naturally and see where it takes you?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I don't think I've ever sort of set out on a walk with the intention of thinking, oh, I'm gonna like have a new thought here or something, but it always just sort of tends to happen, and I'd imagine you and your travels have felt the same way as well. That just by being in a new place, it can kind of reset your mental map, and maybe lead to kind of new and interesting thoughts. And I always seem to forget it before I go on a trip and kind of wonder like, why am I, spending money and taking time to do this? But then come back kind of remembering that fact, and I think it's kind of hilarious and magical in some way.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Mike.
I just wanted to say I really appreciated your inclusion of art history and literature and all of the other wonderful references to landscapes. It was really inspiring.
Oh, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Other questions, Colin? Okay, well, if not, let's thank him once again.
We are clapping. I'm not sure if you can hear the applause. The mics aren't quite that sensitive. Well, thank you so much, Colin, for your incredible talk. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Zoom and here in person. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Good night.